place that once was, an Eden, unique in its formation. It is a sea within a sea, an ocean garden that has 7,500 miles of shoreline and 5,000 islands and 36,000 miles of ocean. Rich in nutrients from over 60 rivers mixed by cold water currents and tremendous tides. It's home to over 100 species of fish, 18 species of marine mammals, and an abundance of birds. There is a place that teems with life and was once one of the world's greatest fisheries. It is these fisheries that lured the first European settlers and established early America. It is a wonder, and there is nothing like it anywhere else, the Gulf of Maine. As my girls were growing older, I wanted them to learn about the ocean and the people that made their living from the sea. So we embarked on a week-long sailing journey to learn about the Gulf of Maine and the health of its fisheries, and to interview people who are interested in preserving the marine life and traditions of the area. To help us with the filming and recording, we had Alex Torres and Nico Danan join us. Right off the bat, they taught Georgiana and Noelle how to set up and use the various cameras and sound equipment. It was great to have such dedicated guys on board to help us get up to speed so quickly.
Well, I'm hoping that we'll be able to put together a good story to educate different people about the fishing industry in Maine and how it's changed. Like hearing Colin talk today, it sounds like it's affected a lot of, Maine's history.
Sailing in the fog always reminds me of Maine. Despite the navigational challenges, I don't mind it all that much, and it makes those clear northwest days all that much more spectacular. Lobsters are thriving in Maine, and even though in recent years the price of lobster has dropped significantly, the resource still represents Maine's most valuable fishery. We are sailing over to Friendship to spend the day with Dr. Diane Cowan, to snorkel in her lobster pound and to learn more about these amazing creatures. Diane Cowan has worked as a research scientist and educator. In 1996, she founded the Lobster Conservancy, which works with fishermen and volunteers throughout the Gulf of Maine region to sustain a thriving lobster fishery through science and community. Many people refer to her as the Jane Goodall of lobsters.
Just think of molting as a continuous process, not an event. So a lobster spends its entire life, even as an embryo, always preparing for, recovering from, or getting out of its shell.
The very first lobster pounds were built in Nova Scotia in 1830. And then they started cropping up in the U.S. in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 1850s. This one was probably built, it's one of the early pounds, somewhere between 1830 and 1850. If you look, you can look at pounds all over the place. We have two more on the next island. This one is so gorgeous because it's huge, 6 acres.
Let's see how they look. Oh, how many will everybody eat? So you can see he has this big bulky claw, and the males with the big bulky, that's a secondary sex characteristic, so they don't get that till they're mature. And the females find that very attractive. They go for the big clawed males, but it's not just that. A male who defends her when she's soft, when she molts, that's very important. So the bigger, literally the bigger her tail, the more offspring she can carry. The easiest way to tell male from female, and even on juveniles, ouch, once they're, these really hurt. You're my dinner. I'm gonna remember you, left crusher male with the short left antenna. Is yours. Okay. I'll just lift it and put it right back down, so we don't cool off the water. Okay? But watch that steam, it's really hot. Be careful. Grab a plate and go grab whatever you want out of there.
No, your chicken is here.
And I figured we could just put one in between each.
I think friendship lobsters are the best.
Everybody has.
You think North Haven?
I think when he did.
Oh, do you want any lobster lessons while you're eating? Yeah. No, they pee out of their heads. They have 2 urinary bladders. I better get a whole lobster. I can't explain this without.
They pee out of their heads?
Anyway, so they pee out of here. See these little holes at the base? You gotta see this. Right there and there. That is where they release their urine.
It's not
here? No. Because with lobsters, it's totally different. The male invests more than just the sperm in that part of the operation. Remember I said that the female stores the sperm? Well, the male puts nutrients. He packets his sperm in a little packet called spermatophore, and the spermatophore can live for 2 years. That's how well he treats, he supplies them with nutrients.
Real man.
But in exchange, he doesn't make so many. I mean, he makes enough for this female for a couple of broods, maybe. Because, she can fertilize her eggs and then hatch them a year later and fertilize another from the same mating female. Plus, the male embraces the female. They actually mate face to face, and he picks her up and holds her off the bottom. And he has to have big enough legs to get around her.
So her back is to the bottom?
Yeah. And they flutter their swimmerettes against each other, and then he puts those calcified pleopods right in there. Yep.
Then Colin said that they won't change from lobsters from doing traps to a big machine to catch them because the lobstermen won't let them. Mm-hmm. So why did
but they still drag for lobsters some places.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. And that's bad. And they should just stop that. Federal waters.
So why did the cod fishermen let the trawler things come?
I don't know. That's a really good question, and I'm not the right person to ask because I don't know but I know that we let foreign fleets in too.
Diane was so welcoming, and being able to spend the whole day with her was really cool because it was really nice to kind of have that whole day to make a connection and build a connection with someone.
The next day we were going lobstering with Foy Brown. Foy is a boat builder and lobsterman from North Haven and a vital member of the community. We were meeting him at Brown's boatyard, which had been in his family for many generations.
What are the chances, Foy? Getting the blue lobster?
Yeah.
1,000,000 to 1, or maybe 2,000,000 to 1.
Being on the boat made us think about what Colin said about the lobster industry and how it developed. Before there was a lobster industry in America, lobster was considered poverty food and was used mostly as bait and for fertilizer. They were easily picked up at the water's edge after being washed up on shore. Early on, there was little industry or market for lobsters. As the population grew, a small coastal market developed and hoop traps were used to scoop up lobsters that walked over these baited nets. It was extremely difficult to transport and distribute lobsters, as they need ocean water and must be cooked before they die. In the late 1700s, fishermen built smack boats, which had special inboard water wells to keep lobsters alive. These smack boats would deliver lobsters up and down the New England coast, and the market expanded. Peddled boiled lobsters became very popular in cities. Vacationers to Maine went back to cities like Boston and New York, also spreading the good word about lobsters. Lobster meat became a valuable source of protein during World War II when there was beef rationing. By the 1840s, demand for lobster had increased dramatically and canneries started springing up along the coast, which allowed lobster meat to be distributed to the Midwest, the South, and to Europe. Besides a small oyster cannery, lobster canneries were the first canneries in America, and canned lobster turned out to be a huge success. At this time, hoop traps had been replaced by the wooden parlor traps, which needed less attending to and could be used in deeper water. By the 1800s, lobsters were being overfished by the canneries, which were processing over 9 million lobsters, including taking the juvenile lobsters. There were obvious signs of depletion, with lobstermen reporting small catches. The first conservation laws in Maine were passed around the time to protect egg-bearing females and the small lobsters.
As I watched Foy and Scott, I realized that conservation ethics are a significant part of the industry today. In Maine, there are both minimum and maximum size regulations to protect the breeding stocks. Small lobsters are thrown overboard so they have a chance to reproduce, and large lobsters are not kept so they can keep reproducing. Furthermore, lobstermen also do not keep egg-bearing females of any size. Instead, they identify her as a reproducing female by cutting a V-notch in their tail before throwing her back overboard. Traps also have conservation aspects to them, with vents where small lobsters can easily escape and biodegrade if the trap is lost. All these practices protect the resource and help ensure the future of the lobster industry. It was interesting to reflect back on what Carl, Colin, and Sherm said about how the conservation ethic developed.
All we tried to do was keep everything on an even keel and hope it's going to be beneficial to everybody in the community as far as the regulations around the community is concerned. And protecting the shot lobsters, and we wanted people to put all of those overboard for their own benefit, you know, because there was a time years and years ago when they were catching bringing shot lobsters in and feeding the chickens. And that had to stop to build up your industry, and so it did.
Yeah.
It's still the guy who owns the boat is still going out and actually the guy fishing it, and maybe he hires, you know, one guy to help him out. It's essentially like an early 19th century fishery still today, which is part of the reason that there's still lobster around and there aren't any cod around. And every single bit of the bottom of the Maine coast was claimed by one group of lobstermen or another. Each harbor, each little place like Boothbay Harbor or East Boothbay or Southport, those lobstermen have their own territory of the bottom. The bottom's chopped up into pastures that each control. And they wouldn't let anybody else in unless you sort of had the permission of the community to do it. And that meant, and they would use violence if they had to stop you. Probably just, you know, steal your traps or mark your traps so you know, or pull your traps up and take the lobsters out and leave you a note saying go away. They did all those things, literally. They would sort of make sure that their community controlled their territory because they wanted to make sure that not too many people came in and overfished their lobster and that everyone fished their way in fishing for lobster. So it wasn't exactly legal, but that's again part of the reason that lobstering has survived.
See where it's growing a new leg there? Oh, that was close.
What happens if he grabs your finger?
I'll probably scream, probably swear too. But when these guys shed and they pull everything, and their claws, all these legs, what they do is they split open right down that seam in the back, and they drop their tail down, and they pull themselves out there, and these smellers will come out and they'll be curled right up just like a dairy jewel.
As I watched Foy and Scott work, I was always curious to see what they caught. Pulling up a trap was always a bit of a surprise.
That right in his eye socket. I measured one. If it goes down over his back there, he's too short. If it's his back is longer than that. Like if you get a gigantic one that's like that, you got to throw that back too.
How many lobsters does all his eggs produce?
They produce a lot of little ones, but probably 2, 3 will grow up to be caught because everything feeds on them. And the baby ones, when they hatch, they float for 9 days and they shed like 7 or 8 times. And so all the birds and stuff, you know, and all the fish. I think I just saw a couple of storm petrels fly by. You know, they're always flitting over the water. They're probably picking up them baby lobsters left and right.
This trap was full of lobsters, and it made me wonder about what Carl and Colin had said about the lobster population growing. The landings are increasing, and lobsters are thriving in the region, despite an increased number of traps and effort. The people we talked with over the last few days discussed a number of different theories of what might be causing this booming catch. Not everyone was in agreement, and there seems to be no clear-cut explanation. Indeed, it is a mystery. But lobster seems to survive, and I think you said in your book you call it the Great Lobster Mystery.
Yeah, there are more and more lobstermen fishing more and more traps, so the number of traps has grown enormously. And yet, instead of wiping out the lobster stocks have grown as well. So the great mystery is, how can that be?
Some people argue they actually get fed. So
Indeed. There are more and more traps in the water. You'd think that it's more and more fishing pressure. We're taking more and more lobsters. There should be less of them, because that's what's happened with every other fish. No, there's more of them now. It seems like, yes, they may be farming them. If you think about, look at all the lobster pots everywhere in the water, and think that under each of those pots in a place like Booth Bay, the buoy is called a pot, and then there's a line going down, and there'll be a whole string of traps. There's not just one trap, there's probably 4 or 5 traps for each buoy you see. Now think about, from the lobster perspective on the bottom, just how many lobster traps there are under there, and each one is stocked with lobster food. It's like the lobster can't even turn around without running into a feeding station. It's like we just covered their habitat with McDonald's and drive-through windows. Come on down.
A major part of the diet is lobster bait, but work done right here on Monhegan, some researchers at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute found that as soon as you remove the traps, when Monhegan closes their seasons, within a couple weeks, lobsters go right back to eating their natural prey. But Canada has a similar lobster fishery, and they have closed seasons where lobsters are not fed during their hungriest time of the year, during the summer and the fall, because there's no fishing activity. And they have seen the exact same patterns of increases in landings. So you could probably add the aquaculture as the fourth. I guess I discredit that a little bit, but that's just my opinion. Everyone's got their opinions, right?
Another theory has to do with, well, you wiped out the cod, and cod of a certain size eat young lobsters. Maybe it's a predation issue. And a third factor is oceanographic. There may be a long-term cycle involved on top of all this. The local effect of this ocean basin-wide phenomenon is that every 20 years or so, the eastern Maine coastal current switches from hugging the shore, where it would dump lobster larvae in this area, to going further out to sea, where all these lobster larvae will be distributed over flat, muddy bottoms and probably not survive. If we switch again, we're due for it. We're in fact overdue for it. Will the eastern Maine coastal current carry all those lobsters out? And is that the difference between a 20 million pound a year fishery, which is what we had for the previous 40 years before 1985, and a 75 million pound fishery, which is what we have today?
Well, it's the $300 million question for the lobster fishery. You know, competing theories are reduction in predators, favorable environmental, so we've seen a general slow warming in the Gulf of Maine. I don't want to get into the whole global warming, debate, but we have the Gulf of Maine has warmed since the late 60s. There's no question about that. And any kind of warmer water allows lobsters to grow faster and be more productive, and et cetera, et cetera.
Environment, bingo. What I've seen is a fourfold increase in the numbers of lobsters settling and surviving over the winter. And it's directly correlated with temperature. And
then the other theory is, or hypothesis, is that we have a well-managed fishery. And they're all competing, and they probably all work together. In that it's not just because there are no groundfish gobbling up lobsters. It's not just because we have a well-managed fishery. It's not just, but the combination of those three theories, and different people, put different weight on different aspects to it. But we have gone from a period of 50 years where we were around 20 million pounds, and there was still debate and controversy with the lobster fishery, but it was very stable. And then ever since the late 80s, we've really just been ratcheting up the landings, and that's because the resource is increasing, or has been increasing, and the fishery is just slowly scaled to that as well.
Any telling when those eggs will hatch by just looking at them?
Well, she should lay them just before she sheds, and then when she's really, really, really soft, just as soon as she sheds, she'll mate again.
Lobstering is Maine's most valuable fishery, and it's fascinating how the industry is managed. Maine lobstermen have always been protective of their resource, from harbor to harbor and even from state to state. As early as 1828, Maine lobstermen banned out-of-state lobstermen from fishing in their waters. Today, Maine lobstermen and women are directly managing aspects of their own fishery. There are now 7 zones along the Maine coast where lobstermen elect peers to determine local rules about trap limits, apprentice programs, and limited entry for licensing. This community-based model for management is a unique one, and I remember thinking when we were talking with Carl and Deirdre from the Department of Maine Resources that this type of bottom-up and collaborative strategy is essential for the future health of the fishery. How that was set up?
Sure. Like you said, there are 7 zones. There are A through G, starting down east and moving to the westward. The catalyst for having an interest in dividing up the coast and managing it that way was that for a very long time there had been discussions about trap limits along the coast, and there could never be agreement on what was the proper number because people fished very differently from east to west. Basically, the framework for the zones were set up by the legislature, and then a lot of the actual legwork of establishing the boundaries, the zone boundaries, was done through rulemaking by the department, through a lot of meetings with the fishermen. And
I think it's interesting that the zones were, I don't know if intentionally or if it's just the way they worked out, but they're kind of somewhat social boundaries, just natural breaks in the fishery. And those natural breaks in the social structure of the fishery actually follow some of the biological breaks as well.
So once the trap limits were put in place, the limited entry conversation took off, and then there became, once you had limited entry, you need to limit kind of how people cross between zones. So now people can only fish, they have to fish a majority of their gear in their home zone. They can fish a minority, 49%, in other zones.
The top 20% of the fishery, so the top producers are landing 80% of the lobsters. So they're the guys that are, the meat and bones of the fishery, but there's 80% of the other fishermen can outvote them, out-politic them, complain, and so it's a really difficult situation.
Like, one thing that people were very concerned about was that the traditional methodology by which people enter the fishery remained intact. So that kind of tradition that you were talking about of a kid starting out on the coast of Maine with a skiff and a few traps and building up their gang of gear and ultimately, entering the fishery, they didn't want to create a system that was going to interrupt that person's kind of plan, essentially. So a certain number of people have to exit the fishery before a new license becomes available. And so if you go through the apprenticeship program, your name goes on a waiting list and you just wait your turn until a license becomes available. But the major exception to that is that students who complete their apprenticeship program before they turn 18, they can get their license without going on to a waiting list. So it was kind of considered a safety mechanism to make sure that those young people could continue to enter the fishery.
And when he got a lobster license, this is kind of a neat story. Let's see, my grandfather had, I know my dad's was 174. My grandfather had one. My grandfather Murphy in Friendship, he had number 1. So he went to Greenleaf at the time, and he says his grandson would like to have that number if it was possible to get it. Well, he says 1 is gone, but I can give him 1A. So Sherm's number is 1A. He wanted my grandfather's.
And because I'm interested in, how does the biology actually start to interface with the people? And so a lot of the research that I've been leading the last several years, much of it right here on Monhegan, has been kind of that interface between where biology interacts with people.
So in most industries, you only are able to affect meaningful change in time of crisis. Like the automobile industry would be a great example right now. All of a sudden, you're changing things that you never thought you'd change, labor contracts that have been established for 20 years. What, if there were one significant change that you'd like to see the lobstermen adopt now, what is it? Is it the trap count?
For me, absolutely. So we're in an extraordinary time biologically, and we need to be preparing for when we may not be in such good times biologically. And traps come into play. And oh, by the way, you may gain all this economic benefit for reducing traps, reducing some of the expectations on the lobster fishery, and trying to increase the bottom line. Southern New England has already had their resource collapse. And in that case, it was a resource collapse, it wasn't an economic collapse. And what we've seen 10 years after their big declines is there's still a lobster fishery. A lot of people have gotten out of the lobster fishery, but there's a residual kind of hangover effect of the good days. When you get to a point in the fishery like that, the measures to try to rebuild that resource are absolutely draconian. I mean, they're practically moratorium, stop fishing completely, let it build up, because there's this history of we ask fishermen to sacrifice, and the resource pretty much stays the same, neutral to the resource, and the result is either neutral or negative to the fishermen. What a lot of the research that we've been doing, I'd like to change that around and say, if we're going to ask you to sacrifice, there should be positive benefits to the resource, and there should be positive benefits to the fishermen. You should be able to see the fruits of your sacrifices.
Sounds like the cod's not coming back, or is...
And it's a lesson. We certainly have a history of overexploitation of fisheries, and some of the conversations about traps and lobster fisheries trying to take a proactive approach, because I think if there's anything to be learned by some of the failure of other fisheries, is that once you knock a population down, you change the dynamics, and it's very, 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 very difficult to build them back up.
I was happy to learn that lobsters in Maine are thriving, though it is one of the rare fisheries where the resource is flourishing. As we headed back to the dock, we knew our journey had come to an end. The girls were now eager to get on shore and visit with their cousins and friends. I hoped that one day they would feel inspired by our trip. I came away from our journey wondering about the health of our oceans. Yet the ocean presents something of a dilemma. Even though the surface of the ocean looks similar year after year, tremendous changes can be occurring below the surface. These changes can be subtle at first and difficult to detect. When it comes to fisheries, the changes can be dramatic. And if a species is depleted, recovery is extremely difficult. And in the case of the puffins, takes decades to even begin to reestablish themselves. I hope a new ocean ethic develops that involves collaborative and community-based solutions where whole ecosystems are taken into consideration. I've always loved that the ocean appears vast, untamed, and free, though I now realize the ocean's resiliency has limits. The ocean and the life within it are vulnerable and need our stewardship and protection more than ever.